My entire family was forcing me to marry my sister's fiancé, the crippled, illegitimate son of the Felix Group. Later, Felix started his own company and became the wealthiest man around. That was when my sister immediately regretted it. "I'm your fiancé. You're supposed to marry me," she cried. In our previous life, Felix did marry her, and he died a tragic death. But now both he and I were reborn. Sitting at the vanity, I let the makeup artist work on my face. Today, I'd been called up early to get dressed and made up, for no other reason than it being my wedding day with Felix. The door creaked open, and Tiffany strutted in, her high heels clicking against the floor. She looked down her nose at me and mocked, "Coco, you're finally marrying Felix. Are you happy?" I glanced up at her coldly. "Oh, I'm very happy, as long as you won't regret it later." Hearing that, Tiffany burst into laughter, clutching her stomach as she laughed heartily. "Regret? Coco, are you dreaming? Why would I regret getting rid of that cripple? Without that burden, my life can only get better." A month ago, Felix had still been Tiffany's fiancé. The Portman family and the Howard family had arranged their children's marriage since childhood, the eldest son and daughter destined to wed. But a year ago, the Howard family publicly acknowledged an illegitimate son who had suffered outside for years, skinny, with a lame leg, yet still the rightful eldest son. For the sake of family honor, Tiffany was supposed to marry him. Upon hearing this, Tiffany had cried and thrown tantrums for days, making my parents, who adored her, deeply troubled. They couldn't bear to see her step into such a miserable marriage. So they turned their attention to me, bringing me back from the countryside to marry Felix in her place. In the previous life, Felix married Tiffany, but just as his career was beginning to soar, he was betrayed, stabbed in the back by his delicate wife. She leaked confidential information to his half-brother, leading to his downfall and tragic death. But in this life, for some reason, Tiffany herself had persuaded the Howard family to let me marry Felix instead. I smirked at her, raising an eyebrow. "Don't be too happy too soon, sis. The end isn't set in stone yet." After saying that, I turned and left the dressing room. The ending wasn't set, because I had been reborn. As the Howard family's servants pushed Felix into the hall in his wheelchair, the guests sighed softly. I glanced at the man through the crowd. His face was paler and thinner than a year ago, still frail-looking, but only I knew this man would one day become the most powerful figure in City A. At the wedding in our previous life, Tiffany had cried endlessly. But this time I calmly completed my vows. Felix and I, under the curious and mocking gazes of the guests, finished this mismatched wedding. I became Mrs. Felix. After the marriage, Felix naturally couldn't continue living in the Howard family mansion. We moved into our new home together. Back home, Felix slowly stood from his wheelchair, limping toward me. I stepped forward to help him, but he pushed me away. Cold indifference filled his eyes. "I don't need your pity." I froze for a moment, then understood. Felix had endured hardship from a young age, and even after returning to the Howard family, he suffered endless mockery from his brother Henry and Mrs. Howard. Under such circumstances, he had naturally grown sensitive and defensive. Ignoring his resistance, I helped him to the sofa anyway. "Since we're married, we're one family now. There's no need to reject my help." Surprised by my words, a flicker of warmth crossed his eyes, softening them slightly. Satisfied, I smiled. Anyone who suffered that much would be deeply moved by the first touch of kindness. Since I had decided to be a good Mrs. Felix and use his power to take down the Portman family, the very people who had used me, I had to win Felix over. The next day, Felix and I visited the Howard mansion to see his parents. The Howards were even more prestigious than the Portmans. If it weren't for the arranged marriage from years ago, the Portman family wouldn't have stood a chance of climbing to their level. Mr. Howard greeted us warmly, inviting us to sit and chat. He felt he owed Felix and always wanted to make up for it. In the previous life, during Felix's power struggle with Henry, Mr. Howard had supported him. Unfortunately, Henry's maternal family was influential and held key leverage, allowing Henry to narrowly win and utterly destroy Felix. Mrs. Howard, however, was clearly displeased by our visit. Covering her nose, she coughed dramatically. If the sick person stayed home and recuperated, it wouldn't matter. But spreading your germs and bad luck to others is unacceptable. My Henry can't handle that kind of crap. Henry smirked provocatively at Felix. Felix turned pale but said nothing. He was used to this kind of mockery and insult. Mr. Howard frowned, shooting his wife a look but remaining silent. Bringing home and acknowledging an illegitimate child had already been a stretch for him, so he could only privately encourage Felix to endure their scorn. I openly picked up a piece of meat, placed it in Felix's bowl, and smiled. Yes, honey, you should eat more to recover. We still need to have babies in the future. My boldness stunned everyone at the table. They hadn't expected me to embrace my role as Mrs. Howard so quickly. Felix was momentarily taken aback, but then he understood I was helping him. He smiled back and returned the gesture, giving me food in return. Mrs. Howard couldn't stand our show of affection any longer. She set her chopsticks down with a sharp clack, declaring that she felt unwell and needed Henry to help her back to her room. The family dinner ended on a sour note. Back in the car, Felix gently held my hand, hesitating. Coco, don't you feel wronged? Marrying someone like me. A cripple? I squeezed his hand tightly and said firmly, How could I? It's just a physical flaw. Some people have enormous flaws inside, but still enjoy wealth and luxury. Why shouldn't you deserve the same? Thinking of my tragic past life, my eyes darkened. I silently vowed to help Felix change his fate this time, to support his career and make those who look down on us regret it. And those who harmed us would pay the price. Peace didn't last long before Tiffany came looking for me. When the receptionist called to say Tiffany was here, I instinctively frowned. It was like a weasel paying a New Year visit to a hen. Obviously, she had no good intentions. But I couldn't refuse, so I let the receptionist show her in, ready to deal with whatever she had planned. Tiffany still carried herself with arrogance. She casually tossed her designer bag onto my desk, scattering my design drafts all over the floor. I frowned. Miss Tiffany, what brings you here today? I had been reborn a year ago, right when Felix returned to the Howard family, and the Portman family dragged me back from the countryside to take Tiffany's place. In my previous life, I had obediently stayed home, never competing for inheritance or power. I just wanted to live peacefully. But Tiffany still wouldn't let me be. She hated that I could fall in love freely while she was trapped in an arranged marriage to a cripple. She resented that I had inherited all of Grandma's savings and lived comfortably, so she schemed to ruin my reputation, leaving me despised and humiliated until I tragically took my own life. She had wanted nothing more than to see me as miserable as she was. But given my rebirth, I wasn't going to repeat the same mistakes or sit at home waiting to be destroyed. I had opened a studio and set my own plans into motion. Coco, Tiffany began, surprisingly gentle. You know Felix isn't in great health, a cripple, and an illegitimate son. You should know who will eventually hold the real power in the Howard family, right? I furrowed my brow tighter. I looked directly at her and asked, What do you mean, Tiffany? My work is plenty and my time is valuable. If you can't get to the point, please leave. Though I already had my suspicions, she dropped the pretense, her expression turning cold. Henry wants to work with you, she said. You know, despite being the second son, he's got strong support from his mother's side. It's almost certain he'll come out ahead in the future battle for control of F Group. Oh? I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. Why would Henry want to work with me then? Despite lacking maternal support, it's clear Mr. Howard dotes on Felix. Tiffany's tone turned sharp and irritated. No matter how much Mr. Howard dotes on him, he wouldn't hand everything to a bastard. And look at him, all skin and bones. He won't live long anyway. I'm pitying you, thinking of you as my sister. I don't want you to end up a lonely widow, so I'm giving you this opportunity. Ha! Like anyone would believe Tiffany actually cared about me. So what do you want? I finally asked. Relieved, Tiffany regained her smug demeanor. You don't have to do much, she said. Just keep an eye on Felix and report any company secrets. When necessary, help Henry tamper with or steal documents. I couldn't help but laugh. Do you realize what you're suggesting is illegal? And you're brazenly saying it here? Tiffany froze, realizing too late that she'd been tricked. Before she could speak, I interrupted. Forget it. Felix and I have a loving marriage. There's no chance for you to exploit. I'll also inform Felix about your plans. Thanks for the warning. Enraged, Tiffany's face turned red as she shouted, Coco, don't be disrespectful. You'll regret this. We'll see who regrets it. I looked her straight in the eyes, unafraid. Assistant, call security to escort Miss Tiffany out, I ordered coldly through the intercom. Fuming, Tiffany stomped out of my office. Watching her leave, my muscles finally relaxed. Memories of the torment she inflicted on me in my past life were still so vivid that even seeing her now made my body tense. In that previous life, I had willingly joined forces with Henry, but in this one, even though I didn't marry Felix, Tiffany still came, trying to persuade me to be their informant. It made sense, though. Growing up, everyone had told Tiffany that her future husband would be Henry, the young master of the Howard family. She'd had a crush on him since childhood, and despite his constant affairs, she was deeply in love with him. In my previous life, she'd even risked jail time to help Henry seize the family assets. But I wasn't like Tiffany. I wasn't so easily manipulated. The most important thing was that Henry had often helped Tiffany commit her wrongdoings. They were on the same boat, my enemies, the people I sought revenge on. When I got home, I hesitated for a moment, but decided to tell Felix that Tiffany had come to the office today. Felix seemed surprised that I would bring it up. She said Henry wants to collaborate with me, I told him, but I refused him. I told Felix everything, honestly. But you still need to be careful of the people around you, especially those who have access to confidential files in the company. In my past life, Tiffany had been able to steal confidential documents so easily only because there had to be accomplices inside the company. After hearing what I said, Felix's face turned serious. He seemed almost surprised that I had refused Henry's offer. "Why did you refuse him?" he asked. His offer must have been very tempting. I was stunned that he'd asked such a thing. I thought for a moment, anger welling up inside me. Then I said to him, "Because I love you. I'm your wife. Since we're in this together, I won't abandon you. Why don't you trust me? Or do you not believe someone can love you unconditionally?" Looking at Felix's pale, sickly face, I felt a sudden sadness. This insecure man had finally opened his heart to his wife in our past life, only to be betrayed by the one he loved most. Felix stared at me for a long time, his lips trembling. Then suddenly, he pulled me into a tight hug, holding me as if he wanted to merge our souls into one. "Coco, please don't betray me," he whispered. "You're all I have left." During the new year, Felix and I returned to the Howard family mansion for dinner. I squeezed his hand gently to comfort him. He looked up at me and gave a small, warm smile. Over the past few months, our relationship had slowly warmed. He was finally beginning to open up to me. But Mrs. Howard and Henry still treated us with the same disdain they had 6 months ago. Henry's eyes burned with even more hostility. He clearly hadn't expected me to refuse his offer. But he hadn't given up either. When I came out of the restroom that evening, a shadow suddenly grabbed me, dragging me back inside. I struggled in the darkness, and in the dim light filtering through the frosted glass, I saw who it was, Henry, in the confined space, with his heavy breathing and my body restrained. My mind flashed back to that cold night in my past life, when Tiffany had framed me and I'd been assaulted by a criminal. Luckily, it was winter and I was dressed warmly. Henry pinned me against the sink, holding me tight as his breath ghosted against my ear. "Coco," he murmured, "I'll give you another chance. Join me. It's much better than staying with that cripple." His voice was low, cruel. He brushed his fingers along my ear, making me shiver. "No, I won't." I mustered all my strength to resist, tears welling uncontrollably. "Oh?" he sneered. "Why? Don't tell me you've actually fallen for that cripple. Can he satisfy you? If you come with me, I won't treat you badly. And now you have no other choice." He started tugging at my clothes, and I couldn't help but scream. But Henry clamped his hand tightly over my mouth. My strength was fading fast. Just as I was about to lose hope, the bathroom door burst open. Felix stumbled in. Seeing someone enter, Henry relaxed his grip for an instant. I shoved him away and ran straight into Felix's arms, breaking into tears from fear and humiliation. Felix hugged me tightly, his hand gently patting my back to comfort me. Henry, standing nearby, loosened his tie, his expression calm and confident. Moments later, Mr. and Mrs. Howard rushed in behind Felix, their footsteps frantic. But Henry didn't panic. He just waited almost casually for them to see the scene. Mr. Howard was so furious that his cane nearly slipped from his trembling hand. He pointed at Henry, struggling to find words, but Henry spoke first. "Dad, she seduced me," Henry said, feigning outrage. "She waited for me outside the restroom, then jumped on me and pulled me inside. She said she preferred me, that my brother couldn't satisfy her, that I was better." He dragged out his words deliberately, glancing provocatively at Felix. I looked up at Felix, whose already pale face turned ghostly white. I wanted desperately to explain, to cry out that it wasn't true. "I didn't, it wasn't me." "I know," Felix interrupted softly. "I believe you." He pressed my head gently against his chest, shielding me from their stares. The truth was obvious to everyone, but no one dared to say it aloud. That was the reality of a powerful family. Mr. Howard slammed his cane against the polished wooden floor, the sharp crack echoing through the silent hall. You! He was shaking with anger, words failing him. His health had been declining over the years, but he had never imagined that his own son would commit such a disgraceful, unethical act under his very roof. Before he could continue, Mrs. Howard stepped forward, cutting him off sharply. "Henry has always been well-behaved since he was a child," she said coldly. "With so many wealthy young women chasing after him, how could he possibly be interested in a married woman?" "It must be this vixen seducing—" Henry pointed at me. "Yes, Mom, you know me well," he said, following her lead and looking pitiful as he reached for her hand. "My boy, you've been wronged," Mrs. Howard cooed, patting Henry's hand and pretending she was about to cry.
Seeing that, Felix's eyes darkened even more.
"Besides," Henry continued, his voice laced with mockery, "I can't be sure that if we continue to live under the same roof, my sister-in-law won't do something outrageous to me." He shot Felix a challenging look. "A bastard and a vixen who seduces her brother-in-law. How can you still show your faces in the Howard family?" Mrs. Howard snapped viciously. "You've inherited every bit of that disgraceful mother of yours." "Enough!" Mr. Howard's cane slammed against the floor, his body trembling as if he was about to faint from rage. Felix immediately released me and turned to support him. When he looked back, his gaze was icy, sharp enough to cut through glass. "I will leave the Howard family and start my own business." "I won't fight you for the F group," Felix said coldly. The room fell silent. Everyone was stunned. Henry and his mother never expected Felix to give up the Howard family so easily. I was frozen too. In my past life, Felix had left the Howard family and started his own business, but that happened 3 years later. What had caused everyone's actions to change so quickly this time? Could my rebirth have triggered a butterfly effect? But I hadn't done anything at all. After we left the mansion, my relationship with Felix grew deeper. In critical moments, I could see his care for me. He had noticed that both Henry and I were missing from the banquet, and feeling something was wrong, he rushed to find me, without even taking his cane or wheelchair. Once Felix left the Howard family and started his own business, he seemed more relaxed, perhaps because he no longer had to endure the constant jabs and pressure from Henry and his mother. With Mr. Howard's help, Felix's company was established successfully and began to operate smoothly. In less than 2 years, Felix had made a name for himself in City A. People said he resembled Mr. Howard in his prime. At the beginning of the year, Felix took me to an auction. As I browsed the auction catalog, I felt a strange sense of familiarity. The first item for auction that day was a piece of land near the suburban sewage treatment plant. The suburban sewage treatment plant. I suddenly looked up, remembering. In my previous life, not long after this same auction, the government had designated that area as the site for a new metro station. It was a crucial part of the metro line, a connecting point between City A and City B. Eventually, the government bought the land for several times the auction price. I turned to tell Felix to bid for the land, only to see that he had already raised his paddle. "1 million, he said calmly. The crowd erupted in surprise. Everyone knew that the suburban sewage treatment plant had been abandoned for years. The land was polluted, useless for agriculture, forestry, or fishing, and too far from the city for development. No one in their right mind would bid for it. Naturally, no one challenged Felix's offer. Henry, sitting in the front row, turned around to look at us. Our eyes met, his were full of mockery. Felix made no more bids for the rest of the auction. When the event ended and people began leaving, Henry blocked our path. "You're wasting the old man's money on worthless land?" he sneered. "The old man must be truly blind to think you could ever be his successor." His tone dripped with jealousy. Felix ignored him completely, not even sparing him a glance. He simply took my hand, and together we exited through another door. Behind us, Henry's furious pounding echoed through the seats. Later, when the government bought that same abandoned sewage treatment plant for $5 million, Henry was livid. But one question haunted me. How did Felix know that land would become so valuable? A strange feeling stirred inside me. From agreeing to change the marriage arrangement to bidding on that seemingly worthless land, all the changes in this life hadn't come from me. Every butterfly effect originated from Felix. A terrifying suspicion began to take root in my heart. Could Felix have also been reborn? If I could be reborn, so could he. After all, we both met tragic ends in our previous lives. Once the thought took hold, I began to test him carefully, little by little. But Felix was meticulous in everything he did, never leaving a single gap for me to confirm my suspicions. After the sewage treatment plant incident, which earned us a $4 million profit and admiration from several veteran businessmen, more and more shareholders within the F Group began supporting Felix as the company's rightful successor. That growing influence made both Tiffany and Henry increasingly restless. One afternoon, I brought Felix lunch and happened to see Tiffany entering his office. Felix and I exchanged glances, and curiosity got the better of me. I quietly hid behind the door, sitting on the sofa with my snack, waiting to see what she would do. The door creaked open. I couldn't see their faces, but I could hear every word clearly. "Felix!" Tiffany's voice was sweet, so sweet it gave me goosebumps. There was a shuffle of footsteps, followed by Felix's calm, cold tone. "Miss Tiffany, stop! It's inappropriate for a man and woman to be so close, especially when I'm married to your sister. Such behavior is improper. Felix, you know it should have been me marrying you," Tiffany blurted. "We missed our chance 3 years ago, but if I'm willing now, would you still want me?" As she spoke, I could hear her moving closer, pressing against him. Felix took a few steps back. It was unexpected, but somehow it made sense. In this lifetime, Tiffany hadn't married Felix, but Henry didn't want her either. He had countless women to choose from, and she was the plainest among them. Now that she was no longer useful to him, he had naturally discarded her. Honestly, I'd even doubted before whether Henry ever cared for Tiffany at all, or if their affair had simply been an act of convenience, a thrill of betraying his crippled brother. Now Tiffany was panicking. Henry refused to marry her, and she was running out of options. She was older now, and though Henry never acknowledged their relationship publicly, everyone in high society knew about their affair. No one wanted a woman with a tarnished reputation, so she was desperate enough to go after the same crippled man she once scorned. Maybe I had been cracking my seeds too loudly because Tiffany suddenly shouted in alarm, Who's there?" I stood up and stepped out from behind the door, casually spreading my hands to show her the sunflower seeds.
"You!"
Tiffany gasped.
"Were you eavesdropping?"
"What did you hear?" "Oh, I was just sitting here, listening," I said casually, walking over and sitting in Felix's office chair like it belonged to me. "I heard you want to be Felix's concubine or mistress." "Concubine? Don't insult me, Coco," Tiffany shouted, face flushed red with anger. She tried to slap me, but Felix swiftly stepped in and stopped her. "Oh, did I get it wrong?" I asked with a teasing smile. "You just want to share a husband with your sister, right? Well, that's called a concubine in ancient times." "But Felix doesn't make those decisions, I do," I added, lounging comfortably in the chair. Felix smiled indulgently, saying nothing. "You should be asking me," I continued smoothly. "After all, in ancient times, the main wife decided whether a concubine was acceptable." I met Tiffany's eyes with a challenging glare. Tiffany, knowing she had no standing to argue, turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I turned to Felix, fluttering my lashes playfully. "Did I say something wrong, honey?" Felix chuckled softly, patting my head. "Whatever my wife says is right." Then he added, his voice gentle but firm, "But your husband here won't be taking any concubines." Meanwhile, Henry was growing more desperate than ever. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Howard's health had declined sharply, leaving most of the company's management in Henry's hands. But just like before, he could barely keep things afloat, and now the company was showing clear signs of decline. Under such circumstances, the shareholders began demanding that Felix return to take charge, replacing Henry. Even though Felix had left the Howard family to start his own business, he still held equal inheritance rights. Legally, he was just as qualified as Henry to compete for control of the company. And so Henry panicked. Felix and I were woken up by an urgent phone call from Henry. We exchanged worried glances. As expected, Henry's anxious voice came through the receiver, sharp against the quiet night. "Dad's not going to make it. He wants to see you. One last time. Come home quickly." We hurriedly got dressed and drove to the Howard family estate. In my previous life, Mr. Howard had lived a few more years, but because of a series of butterfly effects, everything seemed accelerated in this world. His critical condition had been expected. The Howard estate was brightly lit and bustling with people. The atmosphere was heavy and tense, Felix held my hand tightly as we walked in. I could feel the sweat in his palm. Mr. Howard hadn't been a good father or husband, but over the years, we'd seen his guilt and his attempts to make amends toward Felix. Despite any resentment Felix might have held, facing his father's end stirred complicated emotions. We were stopped at the door and made to wait for a long time before Henry finally appeared. He allowed Felix to go in but blocked my path. "This is a family matter, Miss Tiffany. You shouldn't hear Mr. Howard's final words." I pressed my lips together and said nothing, standing outside anxiously. Time passed without movement. Felix still hadn't come out. My worry grew. I feared something might have happened to him but couldn't just rush in to check. "Worried about your husband, sis?" Henry's voice came from behind me, calm now, the urgency from earlier completely gone. I glared at him, refusing to rise to his taunt. He wasn't annoyed. Instead, he smiled faintly and continued, "3 years ago, you turned me down here. I wonder if you'll regret it after tonight." A chill ran down my spine. Something felt off. Just then, a familiar figure approached and whispered something into Henry's ear. The man wore a bent baseball cap that shaded most of his face, but his build and profile seemed oddly familiar. Before I could think further, several police officers suddenly burst in. They showed their badges and announced, "We're from the police department. We received a tip that Mr. Felix is involved in tax evasion and money laundering. There's substantial evidence. Mr. Felix needs to come with us for investigation." I was stunned. Instinctively, I looked at Henry. He only shrugged, but the triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. "Officer, someone's framing him," I pleaded desperately. "He's law-abiding. He'd never do such things." But it was no use. No one listened. All I could do was watch helplessly as the police broke in and took Felix away. Mr. Howard was also shocked by the scene. His breathing grew rapid, and that night he passed away completely. That farcical night finally ended at dawn. Everyone left the Howard estate, and soon, the news of Felix's arrest spread throughout a city. Many opportunists quickly turned to Henry, and the stock price of Felix's company plummeted overnight. It was then that I suddenly remembered where I'd seen that familiar figure before, Diana. He was a core member of Felix's team, someone who had been with him since the company was founded. I'd seen him a few times and remembered how he always greeted me warmly, calling me sister-in-law. I had never doubted him, but now, he had been there that night at the Howard estate. It all made sense. He was Henry's man. The so-called evidence the police had received had clearly come from him. I staggered back home, lost in a daze, only to notice something unusual at the entrance. Felix and I both had OCD. Our home was always meticulously organized, everything in its fixed order. But that morning, the slippers at the entrance had been moved. They hadn't been like that when we left last night. Alarm bells rang in my mind. I rushed to Felix's study, only to find that all the confidential documents related to his work were gone. This couldn't have been a simple burglary. Not at such a specific time. Not after what had happened last night. I immediately called the police and contacted property management to check the surveillance footage from the night before. The results came quickly. Tiffany was caught. In the interrogation room, I confronted her furiously. "How dare you? Using such a pathetic theft method, you were bound to get caught." "So what?" Tiffany sneered, her face expressionless. "I just have to serve a few years in prison. When I get out, he promised he'd marry me." Of course, I knew exactly who she meant. Henry. I stared at her, stunned. Tiffany had completely lost her mind. She would do anything for Henry, even ruin herself, just for the faintest glimmer of hope. But she wasn't wrong. Her crude little operation had caused us irreparable damage. Henry had once again gotten hold of Felix's company secrets. Just when despair began to crush me, the news came. Felix had been released and acquitted. And at the same time, Henry was arrested and imprisoned. He had colluded with Diana and Tiffany to steal company secrets, and was also suspected of forging evidence to frame others. The charges were enough to keep him behind bars for years. When I arrived outside the police station, the sky had already darkened. Felix was standing alone under a streetlight, still wearing the same coat he had hurriedly thrown on that night a few days ago. His tall figure looked solitary and desolate against the pale light. My eyes filled with tears. I ran into his arms, sobbing. Felix held me tightly. "Don't worry. Do you know who your husband is?" "How could I be taken down so easily?" he murmured reassuringly. He told me that he had long known Diana was Henry's man. That's why he had deliberately kept him close. If you eliminate one Diana, there'll just be another James or John. It's better to keep him where I can see him. That way I can control his every move. My throat tightened. Next time, don't keep things from me, I choked out. I worried about you for so long. Felix's arms tightened around me. To my surprise, I realized he was standing firmly, no longer showing any signs of the instability that used to plague him. Under my questioning gaze, he finally admitted softly, I kept a low profile before to avoid Henry's traps. Oh? I asked, half angry, half relieved. So there's no need to stay low now? No need, he said simply. Henry's not coming out. Stunned, I looked up at him, but he only pressed my head gently against his chest. The late autumn wind was cold, but his embrace was warm. He killed the old man, Felix whispered quietly. For a moment, I froze. Then without a word, I nestled deeper into his arms. I no longer cared whether Felix had been reborn like me. It didn't matter anymore. From this moment on, he and I would face everything together and live a truly thrilling life that belonged to us alone.